Europe has fallen to Germany. The Allies are nothing more than a footnote in history, and former Slavic lands are now breadbaskets for the Aryan race. This is part 2 to my series, What If Germany Won World War II? If you haven't watched part 1, click here so you can catch up on the scenario. We left part 1 with a Europe now not only under Nazi occupation, but subjected to fascist dominance as well. In our timeline across the Western world, a counterculture movement split generations apart. In this alternate timeline, the generations are still divided, however with a cultural split between some of the older generation and their fanatical, indoctrinated children. The older generation still support the fascist states, but just not to the emotional extent that the newer, more impressionable generation does. Party education teaches not only who was the enemy, but to encourage and train children to use outright violence against those deemed a threat to Germany. With each passing generation, children become more violent, fanatical, and devoted to an ever-secured ideology. Education becomes mandatory by the state, but the type of education would be only to solidify the racial ideology of the party, nothing else. History, science, and the humanities are taught in the perspective of the Germans against all, or to shape the mindset of the Aryan destiny. Use of violence against undesirables and military service to the state is idealized and praised. For a man to be a true citizen of Germany, he would have to serve in the armed forces, and for a woman to be married and bear children. To many German children, they were born into a society which actively praises them for just being born. They would have never seen any atrocities or brutality, as those methods rid the fatherland of minorities long ago. Any mention of such methods would be praised as actions of heroes and made in legend, except for the true extent and methods of the Holocaust, which is a closely guarded secret. Throughout this series, I'm sure you've been wondering, wouldn't people eventually revolt against the fascists? Wouldn't they see the oppressive policies and unite against the puppet states and even in Nazi Germany against Hitler himself? How would such a reality even become a reality? Simply from a military victory. The Nazi victory and fascist states they propped up all easily could have fell into disorder or at least civil war, even if Germany won World War II. Nazism in our timeline was a quick experiment. It burnt hot, but quickly was snuffed out. We can never truly know how Nazis would hold on to their great empire if they achieved military victory. This scenario was simply the best case scenario for the Nazis, considering they don't botch the odds against themselves. If things did not go perfectly for the Nazis, they would deal with full-out insurrection, rebellion, and civil war in occupied territories, and perhaps even fighting amongst Nazis inside the party in Germany itself, all which would certainly harm the stability of the Third Reich. If Nazism was to survive and keep its hold on Europe, it would need to deeply ingrain itself in the hearts and minds of the conquered. Military victories would certainly give credit to the government, but two other factors are just as important: economic stability and the infallibility of the leader. In this alternate scenario, if the Nazi economic model held up, created jobs, and allowed good standards of living in the first decade after the war, Europeans would not only accept the new status of German domination, but actively support the fascist governments set up in place. It would legitimize fascism as a new theory to govern by, like monarchy, democracy, or socialism. Nazism is practically a cult, one that takes the word of the Führer, Adolf Hitler, as law. If Hitler or a new leader somehow lost credibility within the early years of the Reich, the system would be at risk of being weakened. As the decades move on, this becomes less of a risk as Nazism forms a solid bedrock foundation through myth and legend. The best comparison is with the founding fathers to the United States. Violence is used across fascist Europe against political opponents and critics, silencing any immediate threats by gunpoint or deportation. This decreases the threat of rebellion as political critics are killed off with frightening efficiency. What would life be like for the average German inside the Third Reich? In our timeline, the Western world sees a capitalist and consumerist lifestyle. In North Korea, the state rules everything. In Australia, emus and dingoes wage brutal genocide against the populace. What could we expect in an alternate Nazi Germany society? It's difficult to assume how a short experiment like the Confederate States could have survived without the North. It would be just as difficult to assume the peacetime economic policies of the Third Reich, say a decade or two after the war. Like I said, Nazism was a movement which burned hot and went out fast. Its creation and sustainability in our timeline depended on having an enemy to fight. This isn't to say it would collapse, but it certainly would have to adapt to a continent without enemies. Nazism didn't place economics as a crucially important thing. Hitler saw economic policy as simply a way to fuel the eventual war effort and sustain it. a secondary factor to building the army and achieving Lebensraum. It's hard to predict how the Third Reich could handle its own economy after the war and after the Russians were destroyed. Nazism was a product of its time. Predicting its economy would be comparable to predicting how the United States would run its internal affairs today based off how the economy was conducted in 1920. We wouldn't see crucial factors which propped up and changed the course. So predicting how Hitler could have dealt with, say, an economic crash or an oil crisis would not be entirely accurate. I can't go into much detail about how the German economy would be after the war, but I can say a brief generalization. I believe that the Reich would organize its economy simply off of Lebensraum. Every part of the German society, the economy, government, and people itself was simply to wipe out the enemies of the Reich. Once Lebensraum was achieved, I believe in this alternate timeline the Nazi Party would reorganize the economy away from the war effort and focus its economy on what best suits maintaining the land it conquered. Standard of living can fall, production of goods can fall, starvation could occur, but the Nazis would never allow 1 inch of land to fall into the hands of the enemy. The Reich never trades with nations outside its realm of influence. This isn't much of a problem considering the Reich has influence over the British, French, and Italians for resources. Raw materials are harnessed through slave labor in the Russian colonies. The German people could see a society of great wealth and prosperity, or one of poverty and rations. No matter what in this alternate timeline, their fate would depend on the military expeditions of the Reich. Society would accept that above all else, territory is what truly matters, above individual fulfillment. In our timeline, one thing that stands out about Nazi Germany, apart from the brutal conquest and genocidal nature, was the advances the Germans made in military technology. How would this have progressed if the Third Reich had not collapsed? Eugenics, social Darwinism, and genealogy were all popular across the Western world at the time, but used by the calculating Nazis to legitimize their objectives for the Aryan race. These were not new ideas created by Hitler, but they were areas of academia that the Nazis harnessed for their own ideology. In our timeline, Nazism made eugenics and social Darwinism unpopular, but had they won the war, research and the ideas would have become far more popular across Europe and the globe. Inhuman experiments on Untermensch still continue in this alternate timeline, sponsored by the government. Scientific advancement is determined by politics. In our timeline, half of Germans in university were studying medicine. Genetics and medical studies were preferred by the state to maintain a healthy and efficient Aryan race. Women would be discouraged from pursuing education or careers that were not beneficial to producing children. Technology is only advanced that is positive to the state. Tech that is threatening to the Reich is discouraged to be continued. Communication like cell phones, the internet, and other forms of communication easy to spread ideas are killed in development, never made available to the masses. Generations of lawyers, scholars, scientists, and engineers grow up fed the propaganda of the state. If Nazi plans were successful, the intellectuals of Nazi Germany hold an extremely violent ideology close to heart. If communication is advanced, it will only be in the control of the state. Technology, which makes the exchange of ideas easier, would be heavily restricted by the Reich. Television and radio are left under the control of the regime. With the German economy dedicated to the military, weapon technology advances much faster than in our timeline. In this alternate timeline, a continent-wide empire uses most of its resources to get an advantage over its enemies. Moving on, in this alternate timeline across the continent, fascism wouldn't be one universal cookie-cut ideology. Each nation would adapt fascist beliefs to their national identity. For example, France, Italy, and Spain would boast Catholicism as their national religion. To make fascism more acceptable, it would be associated with already existing ideas. In our timeline, Vichy France created laws which were to reverse the effects of the liberal French Revolution. In this alternate scenario, this is the universal theme across Nazi-influenced Europe, as liberal and Enlightenment beliefs are slowly strangled. In France, the government creates a more conservative, authoritarian, and Catholic state. This is different than the Nazis, as Hitler aimed to reinvent German society. The Vichy French simply used the existing conservative elements of French society. Nazi persecution of Catholics in their eastern territories creates tension between the French and Germans, but faced with the overwhelming threat of force, the Vichy French would voice little public opinion about it and do little action against it. In our timeline, the Nazis held French prisoners of war as practical hostages in labor camps. I believe in this alternate scenario, the same tactics would be used to make sure the populace and governments would not react against German puppet masters. Britain and its empire become the apple in the eye for the Germans. In this alternate timeline, Britain has lost the air battle with the Luftwaffe, and German troops successfully invaded and occupied the island nation. The royal family fled to Canada, but the remaining remnants of the British government are dissolved, replaced with a temporary military government. After the invasion, the occupying Germans treat the British kindly, even going so far to pay for goods and services. The plan was to ease the occupied British into accepting the new government, disband any fear from the stories of Poland and Russia. It would be a campaign of kindness. However, after months of kindness, the Germans would secretly implement purges against any political and social groups seen as a threat to the Reich. After occupying Britain for an unspecified amount of time, the Nazis would allow a puppet British government to operate once again. This is also needed to maintain the global empire that stretched across Africa and Asia. Switzerland would have eventually fell. Hitler absolutely despised the Swiss, and would have invaded had the war in Russia not gone so terribly. In this alternate timeline, if Hitler was able to win the war on both fronts, Switzerland is invaded and dissolved. Alternate timeline, I believe the relationship between Nazi Germany and Italy would have gotten far worse. I mentioned in part 1 how Hitler's views on race created tension between him and Benito Mussolini, but this wasn't the only issue between the two. In our timeline, the relationship between Italy and Germany was one of convenience and military protection. The war pact was one that would last only 10 years. That was it. While Italy under Mussolini talked a big game, it simply did not have the resources or industrialization that Germany did to reclaim the Roman Empire. Mussolini even told Hitler that Italy would not be ready for a war at least until 1942, upon which Hitler ignored and invaded Poland, dragging the Italians along with him. Modern Italy was simply not built for fighting. As the conflict raged on, the Italian armies failed to capture North Africa and the Balkans. Relations between the two deteriorated. I predict the relationship going down two possible paths. One, after the defeat of the Russians and no real enemy on the horizon, the Italians simply become too much of a burden and Nazi Germany invades their former ally. Northern Italy is assimilated into the Reich. Southern Italy is devolved into a poor outer state. The Italians are unable to put up much of a resistance against the massive, powerful German war machine. Second, if the relationship remained stable and Germany did not invade, the Nazis would have loomed over Italy for decades. Mussolini's Italian empire is nothing more than a puppet to the Nazi Reich. Italy could hold territory in the Balkans, Mediterranean, and North Africa. However, it is dependent on Germany to maintain control over them. In the immediate aftermath of Nazi victory, thousands die from government neglect, rape, and reprisals for uprisings against the occupiers. Even in states like Greece, Yugoslavia, and other regions not set for depopulation like in Russia, Europe's map is redrawn to include regimes only loyal to the Axis. Greece is renamed to the Hellenic Republic, Yugoslavia is disbanded and split among the independent state of Croatia, Albania, and Italy. In this alternate timeline, Europe is transformed into a new age. In this age, a generation of Europeans are born into a society which encourages violence, lack of individuality, and glory to the state. The thinkers of the Enlightenment and French Revolution are despised, and literature from classical liberal thinkers have been destroyed. As more are born into this world, the easier it becomes to maintain the myth of Adolf Hitler. Any form of political opinion simply branches off as a form of Nazism, an entire alternate world of political thought, based on the progression of the Aryan race. Europeans are taught of the ominous force across the Atlantic, an enemy just like the Jews and communists, the United States. Tune in for part 3, which I guarantee will not take 2 weeks to make. This is Cody of the Alternate History Hub.